The city of glass and steel stretched out beneath Elias like a shimmering grid of raw ambition, a landscape he had shaped with his own hands over decades of tireless labor. To the outside world, he was a master of structure, a visionary who balanced thousands of tons of steel on the precarious edge of the sky. His name was etched into the cornerstones of the most prestigious skyscrapers in the metropolis. As he stood behind the floor-to-ceiling glass of his executive suite, the reflection staring back was that of a weary stranger with hollow eyes. Elias was an architect of grand monuments, but the foundation of his own soul was eroding, washed away by the relentless tides of a life lived for the applause of men. He had everything the world defined as success, but inside, there was only a growing, echoing silence that no amount of recognition could fill. The collapse did not happen in a single dramatic explosion. Instead, it was a series of hidden fractures that finally reached the core of his being. It began on a Tuesday morning in a boardroom filled with the bitter scent of expensive coffee and the cold calculation of venture capitalists. Elias had poured 2 years into the Horizon project, a development that was supposed to be his legacy. But as the lead investor closed his laptop with a definitive click, the world Elias had built began to tilt. The contract was gone, diverted to a rival firm through a web of betrayals he had been too proud to see coming. At that exact moment, a sharp pain bloomed in his chest, and the oxygen in the room seemed to vanish. His vision blurred, the high-definition blueprints on the wall dissolving into gray static. He wasn't just losing a project, he was losing his very grip on reality. For the first time, the master builder felt his own internal pillars give way. In the long, agonizing weeks that followed, the silence of his penthouse became louder than the noise of the city. Elias was trapped in what he called a storm of the mind, a swirling vortex of what-ifs and regrets that repeated in a maddening loop. Anxiety became his constant shadow, a cold weight that sat on his lungs every morning. He realized his entire identity had been built on shifting sand. The sand of public opinion, financial accumulation, and professional prestige. Now that those supports were being swept away, there was nothing left to hold him upright. He was a hollow structure, beautiful on the outside, but structurally unsound within. Every thought was a jagged piece of glass, cutting into his peace and reminding him of the terrifying uncertainty of a future he could no longer design. Fear was no longer an emotion. It had become the very atmosphere he breathed. During the darkest hour of a sleepless night, a message arrived. It wasn't from a lawyer or a bank, but a handwritten note delivered via a digital scan from an old contact. Samuel. Decades ago, Samuel had been his first mentor, the man who taught him that a building's strength was not in its visible height, but in its hidden roots. Samuel had walked away from the industry at the height of his fame, seeking a life of quietude in a secluded mountain retreat. The message was brief, but carried a spiritual weight that anchored Elias's trembling hands. It spoke of a place far from the sirens and the screens, where the exhausting noise of the world was replaced by the restorative whisper of the divine. Samuel's retreat was a place Elias had often mocked in his arrogance, yet now it was the only destination that held any meaning. Samuel didn't offer a new contract or a medical cure. Instead, he offered a promise that felt like a lifeline to a drowning man. He promised to teach Elias a wisdom that the world could not give and, more importantly, a wisdom that the world could never take away. It was an invitation to an unshakable life, built on a rock that no earthly storm could move. Elias looked out at the city lights, realizing that to find his soul, he had to leave his old life behind. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. He felt the weight of his designer watch on his wrist, a luxury that now felt like a heavy shackle. The journey toward the mountains was the beginning of a desperate search for a piece that had eluded him in the heights of his success. He packed a single bag, leaving the blueprints of his past on the floor, and stepped into the night to face the silence that awaited him. The road leading to Samuel's retreat was a jagged, winding ascent that felt like a separation. As Elias's car climbed, the air grew thin, stripped of the heavy, metallic scent of the city. Behind him, the metropolis was a hazy smudge of gray, a memory of a life that had nearly destroyed him. When he finally reached the summit, the silence was so sudden it felt like a physical blow. There were no sirens, no humming air conditioners, and no rhythmic thud of construction. There was only the wind through the ancient pines and the distant, lonely cry of a hawk. Elias stepped out of his vehicle, his leather shoes crunching on the dry earth, feeling out of place in his tailored suit. He looked at his hands and noticed they were still shaking, a tremor that had become his constant companion since the day his world fell apart and his legacy crumbled. Samuel was waiting on the porch of a modest cabin built from timber and stone. He didn't look like the titan of industry Elias remembered. He looked like a man who had become part of the mountain, steady, weathered, and deeply rooted. There was no desk between them, no assistance, and no urgency in Samuel's gaze. As Elias approached, his mind was already rehearsing the narrative of his collapse, the details of the betrayal, and the unfairness of his situation. He was looking for a strategist to help him navigate the ruins of his career and plot a return. He wanted a quick fix, a motivational spark to reignite his ambition and dull the sharp edges of his anxiety. He expected a blueprint for a new life, one that looked very much like the old one, but without the pain of his defeat. But Samuel didn't offer a strategy. Instead, he led Elias to a small clearing overlooking a vast valley. He spoke of the battlefield of the mind, a concept that felt alien to a man who dealt in steel. Samuel explained that the architect's greatest failure wasn't the loss of a project, but the loss of his internal territory. He told Elias that the human mind is a sacred space that must be guarded with more diligence than any high-security vault. The city, with its relentless noise, had breached Elias's defenses long ago, filling his thoughts with the toxic vapors of pride and the fragile foundations of man's approval. Samuel spoke of the necessity of renewal, a process that required a total transformation of how he perceived reality. He mentioned ancient truths about the mind being stayed on the eternal, a concept that felt like a riddle to Elias's logical and wounded heart. The contrast between the silence of the retreat and the chaotic roar of the city began to grate on Elias's nerves. Without the distraction of his phone, his own thoughts became deafening. He found himself pacing the small perimeter of the clearing, his heart racing as he realized he didn't know how to be still. He felt a surge of resistance, a prideful anger that this old man was wasting his time with spiritualities when his life was in tangible ruins. He argued with Samuel, insisting that his problems were external, corrupt partners, and market fluctuations. He wanted to return to the fray, to prove his enemies wrong and reclaim his throne. The idea of taking every thought captive seemed like a weak man's consolation prize, a retreat from the real world where power was measured in influence and wealth. Samuel watched him with a patient, knowing sorrow. He didn't argue back. Instead, he reached out and rolled up the sleeve of his wool sweater, revealing a deep, puckered scar that stretched from his palm to his elbow. It was a brutal, jagged mark that spoke of a violence Elias hadn't anticipated. Samuel's voice dropped as he revealed that this scar was from the moment he had tried to end his life years ago. He told Elias that he hadn't come to the mountains to hide. He had come because he had been broken by the very world Elias was so desperate to return to. Divine wisdom, Samuel whispered, is a shield forged in human suffering. And Elias realized the true, terrifying battle was only just beginning. The revelation of the scar hung in the air like a heavy mist, damp and chilling. Elias stared at the jagged line on Samuel's arm, realizing that the man he looked up to had once stood on the very edge of the abyss. This wasn't just a philosophical debate. It was a matter of life and death. Samuel pulled his sleeve back down, his expression returning to a serene, immovable calm. He began to explain that the mind is not merely a place where thoughts happen, but a battlefield where territory is either won or lost. He introduced the term strongholds, describing them as fortresses of thought patterns constructed over years of habit, fear, and pain. These strongholds, Samuel said, were the internal structures that kept Elias prisoner even when he was physically free in the mountains. To tear down a stronghold, one first had to identify the toxic material from which it was built. Samuel challenged Elias to go back into the dark hallways of his own history, not to wallow in the pain, but to find the primary lie he had accepted as truth. Elias sat on the weathered porch, the wind whistling through the valley below, and allowed his mind to drift back to the city. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow. He saw the sterile, cold light of the executive boardroom. He heard the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock that had sounded like a countdown to his destruction. He remembered the betrayer, his closest associate, a man he had trusted like a brother, sliding a folder across the mahogany table with a smile that did not reach his eyes. In that flashback, the betrayal was vivid. Elias saw the moment he realized his signatures had been skillfully forged on the divestment papers. He had been stripped of his own firm, his designs, and his dignity in a single afternoon. The bitterness that had taken root that day was the foundation of his stronghold. He had told himself that the world was a predatory place where only the ruthless survived, and that his life was over because his work had been stolen. This lie had become his reality, a cage of resentment he carried everywhere. He realized now that his anger toward the betrayer was the very thing keeping him tethered to the man's power. By holding on to the debt of that betrayal, Elias was allowing his enemy to live rent-free in his head, dictating his moods and his health. Samuel watched the shift in Elias's eyes and spoke softly about the helmet of salvation. He explained that a helmet is designed to protect the most vulnerable and vital part of a soldier, the head. In the spiritual realm, the helmet serves as a barrier between the mind and the lies of the enemy. It is the ultimate protection for the thought life, rooted in the absolute certainty of one's identity in the divine. To wear the helmet meant Elias had to stop defining himself by his losses or his enemies. He had to accept that his salvation, his wholeness, was a gift that could not be touched by corporate fraud or social scandal. It was an objective truth that stood outside the reach of the city's lawyers. The practical application of this wisdom was far more difficult than any architectural project Elias had ever managed. Samuel gave him a discipline. He was to take every thought captive. This was a mental labor that required constant, exhausting vigilance. Throughout the afternoon, as they walked the mountain trails, Elias found himself constantly catching his mind, spiraling into familiar patterns of what if and if only. Each time a toxic thought of revenge or self-pity surfaced, he had to consciously stop, acknowledge the lie, and replace it with a truth from the word Samuel had shared. It was like trying to redirect a raging river with a single stone. He felt the mental strain in his temples, a pressure that felt like the breaking of a fever. Slowly, painfully, he began to feel the first cracks in the stronghold of his bitterness. Just as a fragile sense of stillness began to settle over him, a sound from his past pierced the mountain air. His smartphone, tucked away in the depths of his luggage inside the cabin, began to ring with an aggressive, jarring tone. Elias felt a jolt of adrenaline, his old life calling out to him. He walked into the dim cabin and picked up the device. It was a call from his former lead designer, a woman who had stayed loyal despite the collapse. Her voice was frantic, breathless with a new kind of terror. She told him that the betrayer was launching a final devastating strike. A massive press conference was being broadcast, accusing Elias of embezzling millions before his departure, a lie designed to ensure he could never work again. The reputation he had spent decades building was being systematically erased in real time. Elias looked out the window at the peaceful mountain peaks, feeling the shadow of the city reaching out to drag him back into the storm. Elias stood in the dim light of the cabin, the smartphone vibrating in his palm like a living thing. The voice of his lead designer had been a frantic staccato, detailing the total destruction of his name. The betrayer was not content with stealing his firm. He wanted to erase Elias's right to exist. Every instinct screamed at him to run to the car and throw himself into the legal fray. He felt the old adrenaline, the familiar poison of self-preservation. He looked at the door, then back at Samuel, who stood like a silent sentinel. The choice was a jagged edge. Would he return to the city or stay to save his soul? Samuel did not offer a solution. He offered a mirror. He spoke of the Greek concept of being transformed, metamorphosis. It was not a superficial change of clothes, but a total restructuring of the essence. Samuel explained that the world is a master sculptor that seeks to press every human being into a mold of fear, greed, and reactive anger. To be conformed was to give in to that pressure, to let the external environment dictate the internal state. Elias realized with clarity that he had been a master of conformity. He had built skyscrapers of glass, while his own internal structure was made of dry straw and brittle ego. As an architect, the metaphor cut through his defenses when he saw his life's work as a house built upon the sand of public opinion. He had spent his career seeking the solid ground of awards, high net worth circles, and the fickle loyalty of the elite. Now the tide had come in, and the sand was dissolving beneath his feet. Samuel's teaching on Romans 12 was a structural necessity. The renewal of the mind was the only way to replace the shifting sand with the unyielding rock of divine truth. Elias sat by the cold fireplace, closing his eyes, and began the discipline of meditation. It was a violent rejection of the toxic lies that shouted for his attention. He spent hours repeating truths that felt foreign to his tongue. He whispered that his identity was not found in his firm, nor was his peace dependent on the words of his enemies. He anchored his thoughts on the promise that he was hidden in something far greater than his own shadow. Every time the image of the betrayer's face surfaced, Elias would consciously tear the image down. He replaced it with the image of a shepherd, of a fortress, of a stillness the world could not take away. The mental sweat was exhausting. His temples throbbed as he fought to keep his mind from drifting back to the city. He was learning to build a new interior sanctuary, stone by stone. The afternoon light failed with a sudden bruising of the sky. The horizon turned indigo, and the birds went silent. Samuel stood by the window, watching the trees whip in the rising wind. The atmosphere grew heavy, The pressure dropping so sharply, Elias felt it in his chest. A low rumble started deep in the valley, the sound of an approaching tempest. "The mind must be anchored before the storm arrives," Samuel said, his voice a whisper against the first groan of the timber. But the storm is often what proves the anchor's strength. He gestured toward the darkness, acknowledging the battle that was no longer just a metaphor, but a visceral force threatening to tear through the cabin walls. A sudden gust slammed into the cabin, rattling the shutters with force. The physical world was now mirroring the chaos Elias had been fighting. The telephone on the table slid as the house shivered. Lightning fractured the sky, a silver branch illuminating the peaks in a flash of white fire. Elias looked out at the swaying forest, feeling the old terror rise, but he gripped the table and breathed. The battle for his mind had moved into the heart of the gale. Rain lashed against the glass, a frantic drumming. Elias stood tall, eyes fixed on the darkness, waiting for the first wave of the storm to test his new foundation. His breath was steady even as the thunder shook the very soul of the mountain sanctuary. The glass exploded inward, a spray that stung Elias's cheek, but he did not flinch. The roar of the mountain wind filled the cabin, extinguishing the fire and plunging the room into chaotic, strobe-lit darkness. In that moment, the old Elias would have been consumed by frantic, paralyzing terror, his mind racing through insurance claims and property values. But as the freezing rain lashed against his skin, he felt a rhythmic pulse of clarity. He did not see a disaster. He saw structural problems requiring calm intervention. Samuel was already moving against the flashes of lightning. Without a word, Elias followed. They worked in silence, dragging a heavy table to block the breached window. Elias felt the grit of wet wood and the sting of cold, yet his breathing remained deep. He was practicing the architecture of the soul, maintaining equilibrium while the world hammered at his defenses. He realized his hands were now steady, not because the situation was under control, but because he finally was. When the gale passed, leaving only the drumming of rain on the roof, they sat in the damp shadows. The air smelled of ozone and wet earth. Samuel noted that the physical debris was nothing compared to the wreckage still clattering in Elias's heart. He explained that a mind could never truly be unshakable as long as it was tethered to the actions of others. To hold a grudge is to give the person who hurt you a permanent residence in your headspace. You are paying rent for a tenant who only seeks to burn the building down. The ultimate key to a mind that cannot be moved is the radical act of releasing the debt. Forgiveness was the highest form of spiritual engineering. It is the only way to find true internal peace. Elias recoiled. The betrayal was a calculated professional assassination. To forgive felt like surrender, letting the betrayer win the narrative. But Samuel challenged him to see forgiveness as a divorce from the pain. By holding on to anger, Elias was keeping himself enslaved to the man he despised. The struggle was visible in the tightening of Elias's jaw. He realized his unshakable mind was still anchored in resentment. If he wanted peace, he had to cut the final cord. He had to stop being a victim of the past to become a master of the present, allowing the old structures of pride to fall. And only through this release could he build a foundation that was truly lasting. With a trembling hand, Elias took a charcoal pencil. He began to write a letter to the man who had orchestrated his downfall. He did not write an indictment, but words of release. He wrote that he no longer required an apology to be whole. The debt was canceled because his God was large. As the lead scratched across the paper, Elias felt a sensation of weight peeling off his chest. The mental strongholds of bitterness and revenge crumbled like dry sand. A profound stillness flooded his being. It was the peace that passes all understanding, a tranquility that made no sense given his shattered career. Yet it was the most solid thing he had ever felt. His mind had finally found its true foundation. The internal storm was over, replaced by a deep and luminous calm that nothing could disrupt. The silence was now holy, a contrast to the violent storm. Elias looked at the letter, then at Samuel. He felt ready to stay in this sanctuary forever. But Samuel's expression was solemn. He told Elias that the transformation was not for the mountain, but for the marketplace. The true test of an unshakable mind is found in the presence of one's enemies. Samuel turned with a final staggering command: return to the city immediately. He told Elias that he must return to the city immediately. He was to walk into the den of his accusers and face the lies without uttering a single word in his own defense. He was to let his peace be his only shield. Elias felt the cold air hit him, realizing the hardest part of his journey was only beginning. The mountain had prepared him, but the city would prove him. His internal victory had to be lived out where the shadows of the past still loomed large and threatening. The descent from the mountain felt less like a return to his old life and more like a mission from a far-off, unshakable kingdom. As the peaks gave way to the precision of the city, Elias felt the familiar vibration of anxiety reaching for him. The smog hung heavy over the skyline, and the sound of distant sirens wailed like the ghosts of his former failures. Yet the sanctuary he had built under Samuel's guidance held firm. His pulse did not quicken as he navigated the streets. The car felt like a small, mobile chapel of silence in a sea of mechanical noise. He was no longer a man collapse. He was an architect returning to inspect a ruin with new blueprints. He watched the people on the sidewalks, their faces masks of hurry, and realized he was seeing them through the eyes of a physician. He stepped into the lobby of his old firm, a cathedral of glass and stone that had once been the temple of his ego. The air was pressurized. The receptionist, a woman who had seen his frantic exit weeks prior, looked up with a smile that faltered the moment her eyes met his. She expected to see the frayed edges of a nervous breakdown. Instead, she saw a clarity in his gaze that was almost unsettling. Elias didn't rush. He didn't check his reflection in the mirrored walls. He simply walked toward the elevators with the steady gait of a man who had walked through a physical tempest and realized that the wind had no power over his soul. The elevator ride, once a period of frantic email checking, was now a moment of quiet prayer. The boardroom was exactly as he remembered it, yet it felt strangely small. The mahogany table was occupied by the men and women who had once been his peers and his executioners. At the head of the table sat the betrayer, the former associate who had orchestrated the coup that stripped Elias of his prestige. The air in the room was thick with unspoken accusations and the sharp, metallic tang of corporate survivalism. They were prepared for a fight. They had their lawyers ready and their rehearsed insults sharpened. But as Elias took his seat, he didn't open a briefcase. He didn't lean forward with a defensive posture. He sat with his spine straight and his hands resting openly on the table, palms up, a posture of transparency that terrified them more than a clenched fist ever could. The confrontation began with a flurry of technicalities, but Elias responded with a resonance they had never heard before. When they spoke of his reputation, he spoke of integrity. When they highlighted his losses, he spoke of the treasures that moth and rust cannot destroy. His words were not defensive, they were revelatory. He spoke with a divine wisdom that seemed to bypass their intellect and strike directly at their consciences. There was a supernatural calmness in his voice that acted like a tuning fork, exposing the discord in everyone else in the room. He watched as his rivals began to fidget, their expensive watches and tailored suits suddenly looking like poorly fitting armor. They were confused by his lack of bitterness. They were intimidated by a man who had already found everything that mattered. The shift in the atmosphere was palpable, a thinning of the tension that left a vacuum of silence. In that silence, the betrayer played his card. He slid a thick envelope across the table. It was a settlement offer, a staggering sum of money that would restore Elias's bank account to its former glory and grant him a consultancy position. It was the Unshakable kingdom returned to him on a platter. The condition, however, was etched in the print. He would have to sign a non-disclosure agreement that effectively validated the lies told about him, burying the truth of the betrayal forever. It was a temptation to trade his newfound peace for his old-found power. The room held its breath, expecting the old Elias to snatch the lifeline. Elias looked at the document, and his former ambition whispered in his ear. But as he looked at the betrayer, he saw the man's hands trembling beneath the edge of the table. He realized that the one offering everything was actually the one who had nothing. Elias stood up, leaving the envelope untouched. He chose the unshakable mind over the gilded cage. He thanked them and turned to leave. But as he reached the door, he looked back and saw the true revelation. His enemies weren't victors celebrating a conquest. They were terrified men huddled in a room made of glass, awaiting the crash. The heavy glass doors of the skyscraper swung shut behind Elias with a definitive thud that echoed like a final gavel. For the first time in a decade, he stood on the sidewalk without a title, a contract, or a corner office. To the hurried masses, he appeared to be a man who had lost everything. To the heavens, he was a man who had finally gained his soul. The breeze through the concrete canyons felt like a benediction. He did not check for news of his downfall. Instead, he breathed in the city air, finding it sweet because his internal atmosphere was no longer polluted by the smog of anxiety. His departure from the firm was not an end, but a necessary pruning. Within weeks, news of his refusal to sign the dishonest settlement leaked through the industry. Integrity, it turned out, was a rare and valuable commodity. He was soon approached by a non-profit organization seeking to build a sanctuary for those recovering from burnout. They didn't want a monument to ego. They wanted a space that breathed peace. Elias accepted the commission, designing a structure where light was prioritized over height, and the foundation was built on solid bedrock. His new office was small, filled with living plants and the quiet hum of purposeful work, a stark contrast to the sterile hive he had once ruled. One afternoon, a familiar figure appeared at his door. Samuel stood there, his rugged mountain attire replaced by a simple suit that still couldn't hide his weathered wisdom. He watched as Elias spoke with a frazzled intern who had made a technical error. Elias did not erupt in fury. Instead, he sat the young man down and spoke about the architecture of the mind. He taught the boy how to identify the toxic thought of failure and replace it with the truth of growth. Samuel smiled, seeing that the lessons of the mountain were now metabolized. The art of mind renewal was no longer a theory for Elias. It was his life. Samuel eventually stepped forward, and the two men embraced. They spoke of the quietness of the heart. Samuel looked around the modest office and noted that Elias's drawings now had a different quality. The lines were surer, the spaces deeper and more intentional. He told Elias that the world builds for the eyes, but the spirit builds for the inhabitant. Elias had finally become a true architect, one who understood that the most important structure any human will ever inhabit is the one between their ears. He was no longer afraid of the next storm, because he had learned that the storm was merely a tool to test the strength of his anchor. As Samuel departed, Elias stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker on like a million small, distant hopes. His mind remained a sanctuary of stillness amidst the mechanical roar. He realized that the unshakable mind was not a destination, but a daily discipline of returning to the Word. The future, once a source of paralyzing dread, was now a landscape of divine opportunity. He was anchored in the eternal, and therefore the temporal world could no longer hold him hostage. This journey of renewal is not reserved for the broken architect alone. It is a luminous path for anyone currently drowning in the noise of their own thoughts. You too are an architect of your internal world. Every thought you entertain is a brick. Every belief you hold is a pillar. You have the power to stop building on the sand of public opinion or the bitterness of the past. The renewal of the mind begins with a single choice to take the first thought captive and to listen to the whisper of the divine. You can trade your shakable kingdom for an unshakable peace. Guard your heart with all diligence, for out of it flow the issues of life. When the winds of chaos howl and the foundations of the world seem to tremble, look upward. Anchor your thoughts in the one who does not change. There is a promise waiting for those who refuse to be conformed to this world. You will keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you, because he trusts in you.